The Atacama Desert, the $4 trillion secret that will end global oil. The $4 trillion promise with a hidden cost. The pumps were still humming when the lagoon went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind that swallows sound. A Licanante elder stood on a brittle, salt-trimmed shore where pink bodies once stitched the water with wings. Now the surface was a mirror with scars. One flamingo staggered past a crusted ring and stopped, legs trembling in brine that tasted wrong. A kilometer away, steel pipes hissed as brine rose into a chessboard of turquoise ponds, money turning to vapor under a white-hot sun. The radio at the guard shack crackled. Another tanker to the village. The well slipped again. Then came the whisper from the boardroom in Santiago, production targets hold. Here's where things get interesting. The $4 trillion promise isn't hype. Stack EVs, grid batteries, and the metals to build them, and the number is real. One Salar looked like a cheat code, grades high, sun fierce, evaporation on overdrive. A single desert poised to bend oil's grip. But hold on, because what I'm about to tell you next will completely change how you think about this. The desert keeps its own books, and the currency isn't lithium, it's water. Lithium isn't rare, clean water is. At Atacama, the trick isn't the metal, it's the flow. Brine moves under halite crust like cash through a vault, separated from the thin freshwater lenses that keep lagoons alive. Pump too fast, the pressure drops. Drop the pressure, the lens tilts. Keep going, and the salt flat sags, millimeter by millimeter, until the paths that fed birds and wells bend somewhere you can't see from a quarterly slide. Meanwhile, demand sprinted. Hydrology walked. Evaporation is a clock you cannot rush. Months to concentrate, months to shed impurities, months before anything ships. Automaker launch dates don't care about wind stalls in July. That mismatch built the illusion. Big reserves mean easy supply. It doesn't. The bottleneck isn't ore in the ground. It's the rate the basin can move brine without collapsing the freshwater cap, and the speed regulators will sign new wells in a drought. What nobody wanted to say out loud was that approvals and capex don't bend physics. You can widen trenches, add ponds, hire crews. You cannot manufacture recharge in a basin set over centuries. Every uptick sent ripples outward, wells blowing more air, lagoons shrinking by rings of salt, flamingo nests failing in dry seasons that used to be reliable. Later, a University of Chile team stitched satellite passes and found subsidence on the order of 1 to 2 centimeters a year in extraction zones. Sounds small. In a flat basin, it's a new map. Water finds different paths. Salt makes new plans. People truck what used to flow. Investors thought they'd found the pressure release, direct lithium extraction. No inland oceans, faster cycles, higher yields. Perfect for a desert that can't spare a drop until the fine print. Sorbents foul, brines vary. Power loads climb at altitude. Rinse water adds up. Some pilots sing, scaling across messy geology is a different song. Even when DLE works, spent brine still goes somewhere, and the freshwater budget still has to balance, on a gauge everyone can see. So the lie isn't that lithium can power the world. The lie is that Atacama can scale at any speed we ask. Markets love abundance. Decarbonization wants an easy hero. But the constraint was buried in the aquifer and the ions, flow rates, residence times, mixing fronts, and a regulator's pen. One drought year moves prices, 2 rewrite contracts. A supply chain designed for perfection meets a basin that negotiates. Who knew? Night shift engineers watching pond chemistry drift. Hydrologists with satellite interferometry showing the ground exhale. Indigenous councils measuring lagoon rims by boot steps, not spreadsheets. Traders who saw the future's curve kink after a surprise quota. They knew, and they watched the world place its end-of-oil bet on a landscape that can say no. The question isn't whether the desert can power the transition. Here's the real question: who already knows the speed limit, and why did they let us plan past it? To understand why that bet felt irresistible and why it might still pay out if we respect the gauge, we need to rewind. The desert that powers the world, evidence. Start with the map that dazzled boardrooms. A tight cluster of salt flats in northern Chile lighting up like a control panel, one basin, Atacama doing a third of global brine-based supply, 2 companies moving volumes that bent price charts. From Shanghai to Stuttgart, the logic sounded simple. Concentrate production where the geology cooperates, ship chemical specs downstream, decarbonize at scale. But that glowing map hides something key. The smaller the footprint of supply, the bigger the fragility. One Salar becomes a choke point. One dry season becomes global risk. The stakes aren't abstract. Automakers built timelines on the assumption that Salar de Atacama's steady hum would keep pace. Utilities wrote grid storage plans pegged to battery-grade carbonate that assumed export slots, rail slots, port slots, and pond slots. Hedge funds layered futures and offtake prepayments onto production guidance that on paper looked disciplined. Meanwhile, a hydrological balance, brine below, freshwater lenses above, was shifting by centimeters and degrees. To understand why, we need to look at the numbers the desert keeps. Pump rates are measured in liters per second, but the consequences unfold in seasons and years. Brine extraction on the Salar has run on the order of thousands of liters per second when combined across fields, moving water that took decades to collect into a chemistry race that finishes in months. Environmental filings and watchdog estimates talk about 1,500 to 1,700 liters per second of brine coming up in peak operations for one operator, paired with substantial freshwater draws for processing and camp life. That's roughly 180 million liters per day of fluid removed from the basin when you sum specific operations and support water, an amount that would sound routine next to a river and absurd in a place where rivers don't really run. Here's where it gets interesting. The Salar is a layered cake. A brittle salt crust floats on denser brines, and above parts of that crust, thin freshwater lenses feed lagoons. Lithium lives deeper in brine with magnesium and boron headaches. Pump the brine too fast, and you lower pressure under the crust. Lower the pressure, and gradients change. Freshwater starts going where it didn't before. That's not a theory. Interferometry from orbit picked up the ground surface, subsiding a centimeter or two a year across extraction zones. Subsidence means the plumbing underneath is being rearranged, with consequences for any spring or pool that depends on the old pathways. Now follow the water budget. Annual recharge in a hyper-arid basin is tiny. Snowmelt and rare summer rains seep through fractured Andean rock, moving like a slow conveyor toward the Salars. Evaporation, by contrast, is relentless. That's why ponds work, and it's also why they take time. An operator can harvest a ton of lithium carbonate equivalent only after months of concentrating brine, precipitating contaminants, and moving streams from pond to pond. A common rule of thumb in the field: roughly 500,000 liters of brine evaporated per ton of lithium carbonate equivalent simply reflects the chemistry. The total liquid handled is often greater when you include recycling loops, losses, and rework. Multiply those flows by the annual tonnage targets, and the invisible factory in the sky has a large water invoice. Meanwhile, the aquifer doesn't care about quarterly production. Recharge rates are steady at best, falling at worst, because warming amplifies evaporation and shifts precipitation timing. Field surveys catalog wells that used to be reliable now blowing more air. Community logs record lagoon levels measured by boot steps. 3 stones exposed in June used to mean the dry season had arrived. Now they show in April. Flamingo breeding pairs decline when lagoon salinity spikes or water retreats at the wrong time. These are not isolated anecdotes. Environmental groups, academic teams, and Chile's own agencies have documented vegetation loss at Salar margins and wetland stress tied to drawdown. And yet the project decks stay upbeat. That's not because the engineers are blind, it's because the corporate machine is calibrated to speed. CapEx accelerates pond expansions, drilling programs step out into new blocks, pumps arrive on time even when permits lag. The gap gets bridged with phrases like adaptive management and monitoring thresholds. But the bottleneck isn't a missing piece of equipment, it's flow rates. You can install 10 pumps and still be limited to the volume you can sustainably move without collapsing the freshwater caps above. You can pour concrete quickly, you can't raise the water table on demand. Here's the second evidence line: time. The geometries of ponds mean surface area is king. You want faster throughput, you need more square kilometers of evaporation. But square kilometers collide with land availability, approvals, seepage concerns, and the risk of brine mixing with freshwater margins. Operators talk about optimization, better liners, improved reagent systems, smarter sequencing, but the physics imposes a ceiling. Even with perfect weather, pond cycles rarely drop below many months. Demand, on the other hand, swings in quarters. When automakers pull forward an EV launch, the Salar doesn't speed up. When a drought year hits, the Salar slows down further. Third line, corporate guidance versus the basin's reality. Guidance bakes in a model of stable hydrology plus incremental improvements. The geology pushes back with heterogeneity. Brine chemistry varies well to well, season to season. Magnesium ratios fluctuate, changing reagent use. Wind events increase dust and evaporation unpredictably. Every variance introduces off-spec risk, which then cascades into reprocessing and yield loss. That eats time and water, and it's expensive. We've seen periods where price spikes hid inefficiencies. When prices soften, those inefficiencies become visible, forcing guidance down or capex up. Look at the financial web attached to all this. The market cap of the EV ecosystem isn't just car companies, it's cathode plants, anode plants, separators, refineries, shippers, ports and miners tied by offtakes and prepayments. A single Salar's hiccup reverberates through covenant checks, penalty clauses, and insurance premiums. Futures curves kink on whispers of a quota cut or a court order. Sovereign funds and export banks that guaranteed projects revisit risk models when hydrology studies point to red zones. It's not that capital flees, it prices. A basin with unresolved social license and water uncertainty gets a different cost of capital than a basin with tight accounting and community buy-in. Every basis point shows up in your EV sticker price. Now ground that in people. A hydrologist who spent years mapping the Salar's flow says, "The problem isn't extraction, the problem is pace." He points to a cross-section showing freshwater lenses perched like thin panes on brine. If you respect the interfaces, you can run for decades. If you cross them, you chase a moving target. Meanwhile, in Tucano, an Indigenous council member flips through photographs of a lagoon across 15 years, bluer, wider, clouded with flamingos, then paler, ringed by salt, birds scattered. "They send tankers now when the well goes," she says, shrugging. "It helps that week. It doesn't fix the year." What nobody knew at the time, or chose not to emphasize, was that subsidence was a leading indicator, not a footnote, and subsequent public studies reinforced what locals reported. When the University of Chile's team stitched together satellite passes and saw the Salar surface settling, it validated what locals were measuring with sticks and stories. The ground sinking a centimeter or two a year sounds small. In a flat basin, it reroutes water. Think of a billiards table with a few new low spots. The ball finds different paths. That's your freshwater lens. Once it shifts, the cost of restoring old flow patterns is enormous, if it's even possible. But hold on, the counterargument says, technology will free us. Direct lithium extraction promises faster cycles and less water in ponds. That's true in principle, and in some pilots it's promising. Yet the evidence on the ground is mixed. Sorbents and membranes foul in real brines that carry organics, clays, and biofilms. Energy loads climb when you have to heat or pressurize fluids at altitude. Freshwater shows up in rinse cycles and regeneration steps, a documented operational reality in several DLE pilots. And the final chemistry still requires concentration and conversion, with waste streams that need disposal plans in a desert with no forgiving river to dilute mistakes. DLE might be a necessary tool in the kit, but it isn't a magic wand that erases hydrology. Meanwhile, approvals don't scale overnight, especially as Chile's courts and environmental authorities increase scrutiny with real-time monitoring and public dashboards. Environmental courts in Chile have sharpened their teeth. Water rights frameworks, already complex, now incorporate satellite monitoring and public dashboards. That's progress for transparency, but it also means that the days of quietly ramping pumps are over. Indigenous free, prior, informed consent isn't a slogan. It's increasingly a requirement with real veto power. If your flow model can't be explained on a community whiteboard, your offtake schedule is fiction. Here's the part markets do like. The path to more supply is slower and more expensive than the slide decks assume. It's achievable, but only within the basin's speed limit. That means capping extraction volumes to thresholds tied to groundwater triggers, designing pond or DLE systems that recycle water ruthlessly, and funding independent monitoring that everyone trusts. It means treating a drought year not as a temporary nuisance, but as your baseline scenario. The consequence of ignoring that is visible in price whiplash. When lithium spiked, it wasn't because the planet ran out. It was because a handful of basins and a handful of companies couldn't ramp as fast as demand wanted. Then, when new supply arrived and demand softened, prices fell hard, stranding projects that assumed the top of the cycle was permanent. That boom-bust dynamic is amplified by concentration. If Atacama sneezes, the industry catches a cold. A flood in the triangle moves indices. A court order in Antofagasta rearranges European battery timelines. Now widen the frame. Alternatives exist: hard rock in Australia, Salar projects in Argentina and Bolivia, geothermal brines at the Salton Sea. Each brings different bottlenecks: higher energy intensity, complex chemistries, infrastructure gaps, social license. They spread risk, but they don't erase it. Recycling will help, but feedstock lags new demand by years. Chemistry shifts toward LFP or sodium ion, lower pressure on some segments, but grid storage and heavy transport still want high-performing lithium chemistries for a while. In other words, the floor remains brines and rocks, and brines are fastest when the geology allows. That keeps Atacama central, even if not singular. So what is the lie? It's the storyline that abundance of resource equals abundance of supply at any pace. The desert doesn't read price signals, it responds to gradients and time. The evidence is written in falling wells, shrinking lagoons, subsiding crust, off-spec batches, delayed ramps, and legal friction. It's written in trucks carrying water past evaporation ponds that glint like turquoise wealth. It's written in Flamingo counts that align uncomfortably well with pumping optics. Engineers knew from the first test wells how touchy the interfaces were. Hydrologists warn that the Salar behaves like a coupled system, not a tank. Indigenous councils documented changes long before satellites did. Traders saw the curve react to permitting headlines and pretended it was noise. Everyone had a piece of the picture. Put together, the picture says, the desert can power the world, but not on the timetable we keep writing into prospectuses. While that was happening in Santiago's boardrooms, a farmer in Siqueira refit his irrigation schedule around tanker arrivals. He stopped planting alfalfa on the far plot because hauling water across an extra kilometer made no sense. A mine liaison offered a new cistern and a measuring device he could check on his phone. He took both. He still watched the lagoon and counted the birds by hand. This is the moment everything changes, when we accept that the constraint isn't metal, it's flow. Accept that, and the story doesn't end, it pivots. The Salar isn't an infinite sponge, it's a gate with rules. Work with the rules and the gate stays open. Push past them and the floor drops, literally. In the next chapter, we leave the charts and stand on the brine line with the people who feel the throttle first. The promise of the transition runs through their wells. The cost of our impatience shows up in their lagoons. Lives on the brine line. 3 days after the subsidence maps made the news, Rosa walked the lagoon edge with a notebook and a stick. She marked the waterline where her grandmother used to set baskets, then counted flamingos, 12, not the 30 she logged last spring. Her goats drank from a plastic trough now, filled by a tanker that rattled in at dawn. They say the pumps are far, she muttered, but the birds don't care about far. The radio said the ground was sinking 1 to 2 centimeters a year in extraction zones. Rosa didn't need the number. She had salt rings and fewer nests. Unknown to Rosa, upstream at the Salar fence, Javier tightened a valve and checked the pipe's vibration by hand. He'd grown up in San Pedro, took the mine job because it paid enough to keep his younger brother in school. The dashboard readouts looked normal. Still, he watched the wind pick up across the ponds and thought about the hotline message he'd heard at lunch. Community report of a dry well. Request for emergency delivery, please acknowledge. The SOP was simple: dispatch a tanker, log the call, update the dashboard. The lived part was, if the road blew shut, if the pump hiccuped, if the quota ratcheted down for a dry week, a family boiled tea with bottled water and waited. Here's where it gets personal. Shrinking lagoons don't just move birds, they move routines. In Sakaya, a school announced water days when classes would end early so families could queue for delivery. A teacher kept math lessons short and turned reading hour into a monitoring shift, students noting cloud cover and wind while elders looked at the lagoon's rim. On the days the tanker didn't come, the clinic closed early to save its tanks. The mayor posted the new schedule below a printout of the company's dashboard, green check marks beside thresholds within range. Parents stared at both and decided which one to believe. A farmer named Miguel held up a faded photograph of his father standing in knee-deep water with a wooden rake. "Harvest day," he said quietly. "We used to cut reeds in October. Now the reeds are brittle by August. The goat's milk tastes different." He wasn't against the mine. He'd taken the compensation package and used it to replace his roof. But the new cistern came with a contract clause that still bothered him: access contingent on operational conditions. When a strike shut a whole road last year, the tanker skipped his street for 2 days. Operational conditions felt like a lock on his tap. Meanwhile, a quiet battle played out under fluorescent lights in a municipal office. An Indigenous council spread maps across a long table, hand-sketched springs, GPS points, years of measurements. Across from them, a company liaison slid a laptop closer, showing dashboards with green check marks. "Our thresholds weren't crossed," he said. "We'll keep monitoring." A council member, Daniela, answered without raising her voice. "Your thresholds missed the year my cousin lost half his herd." The room went still. Everyone knew he'd sold the animals at a discount when water costs doubled. Outside, a reporter asked for a quote. Daniela pointed at the court order taped to the door: adaptive pumping tied to lens levels, automatic ramp downs in drought. "Promises are a press release," she said. "Triggers are policy." But here's the thing: the same aquifer feeds the mines and the villages. A hydrologist tried to bridge the language gap at a town hall. "Think of 2 panes of glass with syrup below and clear water above," she said. "They're connected by pressure, not just by pipes." An older woman nodded. "When you stomp the syrup, my tea spills," she said, and people laughed for a moment before the debate resumed. The graphs showed centimeters. The stick at the lagoon showed weeks. Health workers saw costs in bodies, not budgets. Dust increased when margins dried. Asthma cases ticked up. The clinic kept a spreadsheet of nosebleeds in children during wind events. Highlighted in yellow on the same week's roses, stick marks dropped faster. The mine's clinic, funded by a community agreement, treated more dehydrated elders in summer. A doctor sighed. "We prescribe water and rest," he said. "What do you do when rest is a luxury and water is on a truck?" He flipped a page and pointed to a box labeled "Tanker Arrivals," circled twice next to Heat Advisory. Inequality surfaced in subtle ways. Boom wages brought pickup trucks and satellite dishes. Prices followed. A young mechanic who'd never set foot on the Salar rented a room to a subcontractor and doubled his earnings. 2 doors down, an elder could no longer afford the gas to boil stripped brine from a shallow pit for salt. The town square filled with new faces on payday, then emptied when rotations changed. A new cafe offered Wi-Fi and bottled cold brew. The old store kept a handwritten ledger and a sign by the counter: "Please conserve water." Local water rights became the fault line. In a packed courtroom in Calama, lawyers argued over millimeters and meters per second. Outside, Daniela held a megaphone. "FPIC isn't a meeting," she said. "It's consent before the plan arrives." Inside, a judge asked for new hydrological modeling tied to pumping quotas that could ramp down in dry years. The company team nodded. The investors on the call later asked if the model could be de-risked. The judge added one more line: "Publish lens levels on a public dashboard within 24 hours. The market heard transparency. Rosa heard a number she could point to when the tanker was late. Meanwhile, something else was happening across the border. In Jujuy, Argentina, similar trucks rolled, similar lagoons edged back, councils drafted similar petitions. The pattern wasn't an anomaly, it was the cost of speed. Families adapted the way families do: short showers, shared tanks, garden plots replaced with crates. A boy at Rosa's school drew a flamingo with wheels. When the teacher asked why, he said, "So it can follow the water." His friend added a hose to the drawing and labeled it "Emergency Delivery." The brine line isn't a metaphor here. It's a roadside ditch where a girl fills a bucket and checks it against the mark on Rosa's stick. It's a valve in Javier's gloved hand, and a gauge on his screen that now mirrors the post by the lagoon. It's a courtroom threshold where a clause about operational conditions meets a trigger tied to lens levels. It's the gap between a tanker's schedule and a herd's thirst. And every day it narrows, the transition's promise becomes more dependent on whether that ditch still holds a trickle next week, and whether the green check mark on a dashboard finally means the same thing as water in a pail. The historical context, how the desert became a bet. To understand why Rosa's notebook and Javier's valve sit on the same fault line, we need to go back to when the desert learned to speak in commodities. A century before lithium, the Atacama's first boom was nitrate, salita carved from cliffs to feed explosives and fertilizer. Towns flared and vanished with global cycles. Rail lines cut the emptiness. When synthetic ammonia killed the market, the desert kept the tracks and the habit: extract, export, repeat. By the 1970s, a different light metal quietly moved from labs to markets. Lithium had long been a curiosity in glass and grease, but aerospace and early batteries turned it strategic. In Chile, a military regime reorganized the economy around concessions and privatization. Copper led, but a map of Salars landed on a minister's desk with a note: strategic mineral. The state reserved ownership over lithium, even as it opened the door for private operators to develop it through special contracts. That hybrid, strategic on paper, concessionary in practice, would shape everything that followed. Early Salars were experiments. Engineers in white helmets stood over shallow ponds at dawn, tasting brine and frowning at magnesium. Evaporation was the trick, let the sky do the separation. It was slow, but it was cheap. Meanwhile, across the world, hard rock spodumene mines in Australia supplied chemical plants hungry for steady feedstock. The two paths, brine slow and capital light, rock fast and energy heavy, formed a balance that would swing with prices for decades. Here's where it gets interesting. Chile's governance arc mattered as much as geology. In the 1980s and 90s, as democratic institutions returned, regulators learned lithium by auditing copper. Environmental baselines lagged, hydrological models were coarse. Community representation, already strained by land titling, entered the room late. Still, the national development playbook was clear: attract capital, control inflation, grow exports. A salar that could mint a strategic chemical fit neatly. Then the world changed chemistry. In the 2000s, consumer electronics pushed lithium ion from laptops into pockets. Cathodes shifted, LCO to NMC to NCA, and prices crept up. When the first serious EV programs appeared, a graph in a Santiago office bent sharply. If cars go electric, we're sitting on gold, someone said, and phones buzzed with calls to Beijing, Seoul, and Palo Alto. Offtakes were inked. Pilot ponds became grids visible from space. Policy zigzags followed demand curves. Chile reaffirmed lithium's strategic status, but also doubled down on export-led growth. Special operation contracts locked in production quotas and royalty formulas. Community agreements arrived as annexes. Meanwhile, Argentina rolled out investor-friendly frameworks province by province, letting juniors stake claims across Puna basins. Bolivia declared lithium a flagship of national sovereignty, promising state-led value chains at uni. The triangle formed not as a plan, but as three bets on how to turn salt into statecraft. Inside EV labs, cathode recipes and cost curves did something decisive. As prices fell with scale, automakers set aggressive targets and governments layered on subsidies. A new S-curve lifted off. Supply models translated ambition into tonnage. The Atacama, with high grades and fierce sun, looked like the accelerant. Decisions made decades ago, strategic status without full hydrological accounting, export orientation without deep community co-management, became the scaffolding for a ramp the basin might not tolerate. But there was one problem: time. Nitrate had taught the region that booms end and scars remain. Lithium's difference was the pretense of permanence, a climate transition that painted extraction as virtue. That framing insulated projects from the skepticism that followed copper or coal. If the end of oil required these ponds, who would argue with speed? By the mid-2010s, courtrooms filled anyway. Indigenous councils invoked international norms, free, prior, informed consent, and regulators began to speak a new language: aquifers, thresholds, triggers. Meanwhile, engineers iterated. They dialed pond geometries, tweaked reagents, flirted with DLE. Yet the old choice, evaporation's patience versus industrial haste, kept returning. In board decks, a footnote warned, concentrate growth in Atacama raises single-basin risk. On the ground, Rosa's stick and Javier's valve measured that risk in centimeters and pumps. The result is the bet we live with now. A desert taught to export through nitrate, and copper became the hinge for a battery age. Policies designed to attract capital delivered it. EV inflection points transformed lithium from niche to necessity, but the rules of the basin never changed. The speed limit was written long before the first brine rose through a pipe. The geography of power, Salars, faults, and flow rates. To see why the basin sets the speed limit, start at sunrise on the crust. It looks solid, dazzling white, friable under boot, but it's a lid, not a floor. Below it, density sorts the world. A thin freshwater lens perched like clear glass, then a stack of brines, saltier with depth, layered by iron balance and temperature. Lithium sits in the lower brines, tangled with magnesium, boron, and sulfate. The trick is to tap that layer without collapsing the lens that feeds lagoons at the margins. Now remember, this isn't a lake, it's a basin-wide machine. Snow and summer rains fall on volcanic flanks and high Andean catchments. Meltwater seeps through fractured ignimbrites, flows in slow motion, and gathers in the Salars sink. Evaporation dominates everything here. High altitude, fierce sun, low humidity, and steady wind make the air a thief. That's why ponds work. It's also why a misstep propagates for months. Walk a few kilometers and the crust changes underfoot. Hard polygonal plates give way to mushy halite. That transition sketches hidden structure. Faults, some mapped, some inferred, slice the basin. They act like gates, baffling and channeling brine. Engineers talk about transmissivity, but to Javier at the valve, it's simpler. Some wells respond quickly, others lag, and a few never deliver what test pumps promised. The culprits are those buried walls and conduits. Across one fault, lithium grade can jump. Across another, the brine turns viscous with fine clays that clog pipes and foul sorbents. What nobody knew at the time, until satellites made it obvious, was how delicately pressure fields balance across these gates. Lower pressure under the crust on one side, and you tilt the freshwater lens above like a shallow bowl. A centimeter of subsidence in a place this flat shifts gradients, nudging water toward new low points, starving old springs. That's why a lagoon can retreat without any visible crack between it and a distant well. Hydrogeology doesn't move in straight lines, it moves in fields. Meanwhile, something else is happening beneath the ponds. The chemistry is a moving target. As brine rises and evaporates, ions cross thresholds where different salts drop out. Calcium and sulfate form gypsum, then halite precipitates in searing sun, and later, carnallite or sylvite crystallize if the sequence and impurities cooperate. Operators choreograph pond trains to hit those steps in order, but wind shears, dust storms, and cold snaps can scramble the dance. Every slight delay raises residence time and stretches the clock that automakers won't accept. Here's where it gets interesting. Water isn't just volume, it's structure. The freshwater lens isn't a tank you can refill with a truck. It's a cap held aloft by pressure in the brine below and restrained by subtle capillary forces in the porous crust. Draw down brine too quickly, pores collapse, permeability changes, and some pathways never return. That's the quiet meaning of subsidence. Once halite compacts or intergranular bridges cement, even a wet year won't rebound flows to the old roots. The billiards table keeps the new dense. Fault networks complicate every growth plan. A drilling grid might sketch an even polygon on paper. In reality, production clusters around corridors where faults leak and connect deeper feeders. Wells outside those sweet spots starve or steal from the wrong place. Protective buffer zones around lagoons aren't arbitrary lines. They're educated guesses about unseen gates that could redirect pressure. Get them wrong, and a safe-looking pump can topple a lens a valley away. Extraction physics is as unforgiving. Pumping reduces head, the crust bears more load. Microfractures propagate, permeability evolves, and the system's response time lengthens. To protect freshwater caps, operators throttle flows, stage wells to diffuse drawdown or pulse pumping to let pressures equilibrate. Those strategies buy time but cost throughput. Every safeguard, lower well drawdowns, wider spacing, staged starts, shaves the slope off a ramp chart. Add altitude to the ledger. At 2,300 to 3,000 meters, air is thin and nights bite. Evaporation rates soar by day, then slow in cold darkness. Ponds stratify thermally, wind skims warm brine from one corner, leaving cooler layers to hide impurities. In DLE pilots, thin air pushes energy loads up. Pumps and compressors work harder to move the same mass. Rinse cycles circulate slower in cold mornings, and membranes see different fluxes at dawn than at noon. Field teams adapt, the physics doesn't. Quality rides on geology too. Fault-controlled pockets can carry higher magnesium, forcing more lime or soda ash, generating more sludge, and requiring more freshwater to wash precipitates. Off-spec batches aren't bad luck. They're signatures of crossing an unseen gate or drawing from a layer that seasonally shifts. That's why two wells a kilometer apart can feed identical pond grids and produce different headaches. The geography of power here is literal. Sun and wind run the distillery. Faults and halite fabrics choose winners and losers among wells. Pressure fields decide whether a village spring lives or retires to a tanker route. You can't brute force a gate open without paying somewhere else. You can map better, model harder, and listen to the lens. But at the end of every plan is the same line in small print. Growth is limited by flow rates that preserve freshwater interfaces. Everything was about to change when that reality met a global arms race for batteries. The supply chain clock, demand surges versus evaporation timelines. While the sun drives chemistry on the crust, the rest of the world runs on quarterly clocks. In Seoul, a battery plant manager circles a date when a new line will need battery-grade carbonate with a tighter impurity spec. In Detroit, a program manager stares at a launch milestone and a penalty clause. In Tokyo, a utility finalizes a grid storage tender that assumes containerized packs ship before summer heat waves. All three timelines converge on ponds that don't rush. EV adoption climbs in an S-curve, slow, then sudden, then steeper still. Orders spike when a tax credit clicks in, when a model goes viral, when charging rolls out in a city. Procurement teams translate that surge into spreadsheets with delivery windows and purity targets. Meanwhile, in the Atacama, a cloud bank arriving 3 afternoons in a row can add weeks to a pond train. You see the mismatch? Demand surges, evaporation negotiates. Inside the Salars process chain, every stage has a clock. Raw brine moves to pre-concentration ponds. Sun and wind lift water out, irons reshuffle, the brine steps forward. Operators skim halite here, precipitate gypsum there, shepherding liquor to mother pond where lithium finally tips into a workable concentration. Then the liquid travels to a plant where reagents pull impurities and the carbonate crystallizes, gets washed, dried, bagged. Best case, you're counting months. More often, you're counting seasons. That's the part our customers hate, says a logistics lead on a scratchy line. We can tell you how many hectares we have. We can't tell you if the wind will cooperate. Downstream, a cathode plant foreman shakes his head. If the magnesium is off by a hair, we rework. Rework kills our schedule. Quality doesn't just ride the last step. It builds through the whole sequence, which is why a dust storm in February can trigger an off-spec batch in May. Chemical bottlenecks amplify the drag. Battery-grade carbonate or hydroxide isn't a single number, it's a profile. Sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, each has limits measured in parts per million. Hit those targets and you're in business. Miss them and your customers' yield drops, or their scrap rises, or their warranty risk jumps. So plants add polishing steps, ion exchange columns, lime treatment, carbonation tweaks. Each one adds water for washing, reagents that need delivery, waste that needs handling. Add a kink in any inbound, soda ash delayed at port, fuel prices spiking for a week, and your clock slides again. Then there's geography. Moving drums of lithium salts from a high desert to a coastal ship is not trivial. Rail slots are finite. High winds, close roads. When storms rip through the Andes, landslides don't ask if your offtake deadline is next Tuesday. Ports have their own rhythms, berth congestion, labor actions, a sudden ban on a certain packaging that triggers relabeling. A procurement head looks at a Gantt chart where one red bar turns 3 others amber. We can carry buffer, she mutters. But buffer ties up cash. Meanwhile, the drive to scale pushes plants to squeeze more tons through the same footprint. You can add pond area only so fast before approvals, liners, and seepage studies slow you down. That turns attention to plant-side debottlenecking, bigger filters, new crystallizers, better dryers. Those upgrades work on paper, then meet brine variability and altitude realities. A new spray dryer promises higher throughput, but thin air changes heat transfer, and the team spends a month dialing settings while shipments slip. But hold on, says a voice on an earnings call, direct extraction will decouple us from weather. Here's the fine print. Even when a DLE unit speeds lithium capture, the downstream is still chemistry. You still need to polish, convert, wash, and dry. You still face reagent trains that cross oceans. You still return spent brine somewhere and defend that return with data. If your rinse water is trucked up from a distant well field, your supposed shortcut eats the very resource you promised to spare. Quality risk lurks where supply chains hate it in variability. Brines shift across seasons and wells. A pond's edge leaks heat differently in June than in September. An operator retires a pond for liner repair and flow moves to neighbors with slightly different residence times. Suddenly, impurity profiles drift, and a shipment that passed your internal check triggers a customer's alarm. The batch comes back, or it goes to a lower-paying buyer. Either way, your clock resets. Reagents, energy, and transport form a triangle that constrains scale. Soda ash, lime, hydrochloric acid, flocculants, each must arrive in predictable cadence. Energy must hold steady in a region where the grid wobbles under heat and diesel prices dance. Transport must absorb spikes when harvest season competes for trucks or when a mining strike blocks a key road. We staged inventory at port, a supply manager says. Then the swell shut down loading for 4 days. Our buffer evaporated faster than our ponds. What nobody knew at the time, or refused to accept, was how fragile the just-in-time model would be when it leaned on a single basin with a slow clock. Battery factories were built with cleanroom precision. Their inputs arrived with desert dust in their DNA. Penalty clauses lit up, $500 per vehicle per day on missed delivery windows in some OEM contracts, escalating weekly. Extended storage triggered cell aging protocols and rework that chewed through margins. A single off-spec batch meant warranty risk downstream, scrap rates jumped, field failure models tightened, and reserve accruals ticked up on earnings sheets. Automakers switched chemistries mid-program, LFP for mid-range models, nickel-rich for performance, trying to ease the pressure. It helped at the margin. The basins still set the tempo. Meanwhile, across town in Antofagasta, a young planner slid a new line into a contract, delivery windows defined by hydrological triggers, not calendar dates. The customer balked, then signed. When a dry year hit, the clause saved a lawsuit. It didn't save a launch. A supplier missed a June SOP by 3 weeks, a dealer network pushed back test drive events, and a marketing campaign burned cash while cars sat half-built waiting on qualified carbonate. That's the lesson the supply chain keeps relearning. If your upstream runs on sky time, your downstream better learn to breathe with it. The technology Gambit, DLE, membranes, and the scale problem. Procurement teams begged the desert to move faster. A different promise rolled in on stainless skids. Direct lithium extraction. No oceans of ponds, no year-long evaporation, just racks of columns or cassettes that grabbed lithium like a magnet, then let it go on command. In the lab, it felt like a jailbreak. Engineers dripped Atacama brine through glass tubes packed with sorbent beads. Lithium stuck, magnesium slid by, and the rinse delivered clean LiCl ready for conversion. A stopwatch on the bench beat the pond clock by months. Yet this much of it worked at pilot scale. Iron-sieve manganese oxides, lithium-selective aluminosilicates, organophosphorus resins, tailored membranes that passed Li+ but rejected bulky neighbors. Run a capture cycle, flip to regeneration with acid or a voltage pulse, return the brine stripped of lithium, and repeat. A control room screen showed cycles per day that would make an evaporation foreman whistle. Consultants wrote crisp memos, higher recoveries, smaller footprint, faster response to demand. A minister toured a skid and said, "This is how we save water." But there was one problem: real brine is messy. At the wellhead, it carries ultrafine clays, organics from microbial films, colloids that turn a filter cake to glue, sorbents foul, membrane flux drops, regeneration solutions drift off spec. A technician in coveralls popped a column cap and winced at the smell. The resin had darkened 2 shades in a week. "We'll backwash," his supervisor said. They did, Performance bounced, then slid again. The solution wasn't magic, it was maintenance, and maintenance loves water. Freshwater kept sneaking into the balance. Rinse steps to strip lithium, washes to clear iron or organics from sorbents, make up water to replace losses in closed loops that weren't as tight as the flowsheets suggested. We promised less water, a process engineer admitted, tapping a tank level trending downward. We didn't promise no water. At altitude, energy loads climbed too, pumps worked harder in thin air, thermal swings cracked seals. A kilowatt-hour budget drafted at sea level picked up 10% the first cold front. Pilot versus plant exposed the scale problem. A 10 cubic meter per hour unit paired with hand-holding from PHDS. 1,000 cubic meters per hour, the kind of volume that moves markets, needed dozens of trains, hundreds of valves, thousands of gaskets, and a supply chain for reagents that wouldn't blink at a month of port congestion. Parasitic energy loads, trivial on a skid, became megawatts on a pad. Where do we plug this in? The utility asked, and the site team pointed at a substation that didn't exist yet. Then came brine variability. The same well that fed the pilot shifted magnesium to lithium ratios with seasons. A neighboring well hit a slightly different layer through a fault-controlled pocket the logs didn't catch. The sorbent didn't fail. It underperformed quietly, raising acid use to regenerate and inflating waste volumes that the permit writer had sized for last year's chemistry. Waste returned as a second constraint. Spent brine had to go somewhere. Return it to the Salar wrong, too fresh, too hot, too depleted in key ions, and you nudge the pressure fields you're trying to protect. Economics tightened with each field lesson. Capex per ton looked good until you counted power lines, water loops, waste handling, and redundancy to keep uptime high in a place where dust storms pause work. OPEX leaned on acid, base, filters, and replacement sorbents that didn't last the cycles promised in brochures. A CFO traced sensitivities on a slide. Power price up 30%, freshwater cost doubled in drought, resin life cut in half by fouling. The internal rate of return still cleared the hurdle, if everything else cooperated. Here's the crazy part, improving lithium yield could still drain freshwater if systems weren't designed like misers. A shiny DLE block tucked inside a plant that backwashed liberally, polished with ion exchange that demanded ultra-pure rinse, and sent brine back hotter and lighter than it came could outperform ponds on paper while taxing the aquifer harder in practice. Engineers started drawing cascades of reuse. Last rinse becomes first wash, condensate from drier stacks returns to tanks, spent brine tempered with a blend to match native chemistry before re-injection. The flow sheets got dense. The board wanted simple. Field operators learned to speak in triggers. If magnesium spiked, slow the line, profilter harder, accept lower flux. If biofilm clogged, dose a biocide that didn't wreck the resin. If the grid sagged, shed trains in an order that preserved thermal balance so startup didn't hammer seals at dawn. The desert didn't care about slogans, it rewarded boring discipline. Meanwhile, communities watched for the metric that mattered, net freshwater draw. A council meeting in San Pedro set a simple rule: tie pumping quotas to lens levels and make every operator publish water use live. A company offered a dashboard. The council wanted a meter on the fence. If your breakthrough saves water, prove it here, Daniela said, tapping the ground. Regulators began to echo that posture, writing permits that counted liters and ions, not promises. DLE will find a home in the desert. In some brines, with careful pretreatment, brutal water recycling, robust power, and honest brine return, it can shorten the cycle and steady quality. But it can't suspend the basin's physics. It still lives under the same speed limit, flow rates that keep the freshwater lens intact, recharge that can't be rushed, and a social license that's measured in bucketfuls at a lagoon, not just ticks on a control screen. Financialized geography, the $4 trillion bet unpacked. While engineers argued with irons, another story took shape on spreadsheets, money mapping itself onto the desert like contour lines. Add up what the transition demands and the number is dizzying. Vehicles, buses, grid storage, home batteries, picoplant replacements, plus the upstream mines, refineries, and ports to feed it. $4 trillion isn't marketing. It's factories already pouring concrete, subsidies written into law, sovereign funds writing checks. And under a third of those forward contracts, somewhere, a clause quietly references brine from a handful of valleys. Here's where it gets interesting. Finance doesn't just fund geography, it rearranges it. Offtake agreements lock years of Salar output into the bones of European cathode plants and Asian cell lines. Futures on lithium chemicals, once thin and academic, now move on rumors from Antofagasta courtrooms. A single slide, operator to transition to DLE by 2027, tightens spreads, because faster cycles mean cleaner delivery windows, and cleaner windows mean cheaper working capital. Think of Atacama as a counterparty, says a risk manager in Frankfurt, tracing an index with his finger. We treat the basin like a firm with a balance sheet. Assets, reserves, sun, ponds, permits, liabilities, water, courts, communities, climate. He taps the liabilities. Every downgrade here widens our cost of capital downstream. He's not being poetic. When Chile's environmental authority files charges over brine irregularities, insurers revise business interruption riders. When a university publishes subsidence maps, lenders ask for hydrology covenants in project finance terms, pump caps tied to lens levels, automatic ramp downs in declared dry years. Meanwhile, sovereigns play the long game. A Middle Eastern fund anchors a hydroxide plant in Europe with a condition: guaranteed carbonate deliveries from the triangle, index-linked, but with force majeure that includes environmental injunctions. A Chinese battery giant prepays for expansion at 2 Salars, swapping cash now for years of discounted tonnage, then mirrors that position with stakes in Australian spodumene mines. The chessboard stretches. Rock hedges brine, brine hedges rock, and each hedge traces a shipping lane and a tariff code. Price whiplash punishes the impatient. During the last spike, juniors listed on 3 continents with slick drone footage of ponds to be. The curve screamed onward, bankers modeled forever. Then new rock supply hit, EV demand paused in one region, and a softening macro sent the chemical price down an elevator shaft. Projects assumed at $60,000 had to live at $15,000. Some died, others limped, rewriting offtakes with goodwill discounts. The basin didn't change its mind, markets did. Geographic concentration sharpens every move. A few valleys now steer a piece of global decarbonization. That isn't hyperbole, it's logistics. Ports at Megelones and Antofagasta carry chemicals that schedule gigafactories in Poland and Michigan. A labor action on a rail spur shifts container loadings in Rotterdam. A court order in Calama ripples into an automaker's Q4 delivery call. We used to diversify by supplier, a procurement lead says. Now we diversify by basin, grid, and judge. And here's the thing: one drought year can move global prices. In a hyper-arid system, drought isn't a headline event, it's a baseline with teeth. When snowpack underperforms and summer storms stall, evaporation still steals but recharge crawls. Operators throttle, quotas tighten, tonnage slips. Traders don't wait for official numbers. They watch AIS pings at ports, customs data, reagent shipments, even satellite glint-off ponds to guess inventory. 1,000 tons missing from one exporter nudges a futures curve. 10,000 shifts term sheets in Seoul. Financial engineering tries to smooth the ride. Structured offtakes blend fixed and floating, collars cap pain, floors protect investment cases. Inventory financing turns warehouse drums into collateral that funds the next month's reagents. Governments pile in. Europe launches strategic projects to onshore refining. The US backstops cathode plants. Chile revises royalties to capture more upside without scaring capital out of the basin. Every policy line carries an asterisk, contingent on supply arriving roughly as planned. Micro-stories hide inside those lines. In Shanghai, a credit committee rejects a working capital request from a mid-tier cathode maker, citing Atacama exposure concentration above threshold. In Santiago, a treasury team swaps dollar receipts for euros on the same day a hydrology dashboard blinks yellow. The currency hedge pays, the physical schedule doesn't. In Munich, a CFO allows a quarter of excess LFP inventory to build as a buffer, cash tied in powder, because a judge might write a sentence next month that turns trucks around. Meanwhile, investors price social license, community agreements with transparent benefit-sharing, lower risk premiums, FPIC that's binding and audited signals predictability. Legitimacy is collateral, says a Chilean banker. If a project can ride a dry year without protests or lawsuits, we price it differently. That's not philanthropy. It's math learned from projects that lost months to roadblocks and court-ordered studies. Markets also misread miracles. DLE headlines shaved percentage points off perceived risk. Field performance handed some of those back. The best operators responded by publishing water accounts like income statements. Liters in, liters recycled, liters returned, lens levels versus triggers. Funds noticed. Show me your water P&L, a due diligence lead said, and an engineer grinned, pulling up a dashboard that looked more like a bank app than a mine's. Here's the quiet pivot. Money flows fastest where constraints are acknowledged, not denied. Contracts with hydrological triggers, royalty schemes that flex with water stress, reinjection plans that match native brine chemistry, these de-risk schedules. They don't add metal, but they buy time, and time is the currency the desert sells dearest. Drought isn't a black swan in the world's driest desert. It's the rule. Finance learned to price that rule late. The next chapter of this bet depends on who treats the basin like a partner, not a promise. Water wars in the driest place, hydrology versus hype. While traders argued over curves, a quieter fight unfolded over inches of water. On paper, brine and freshwater live in different columns, lithium-rich liquor under halite lid, freshwater lenses perched above, feeding lagoons and springs at the margins. In reality, pressure ties them together. Lower the brine too far, and the lens tilts. The separation everybody cites in presentations turns out to be a fragile truce. Brine is not just salty water, it's a moving framework of ions. Freshwater is not a reservoir you top up with trucks. The risk comes when seepage and drawdown pull those worlds together. If concentrated brine migrates toward a freshwater margin, salinity spikes. Flamingo nesting grounds shift or fail. If freshwater infiltrates down into a depleted brine zone, gradients flatten, pumps gasp, and the whole pond train inherits impurities it didn't plan for. Engineers call it mixing fronts. Villagers call it the year the lagoon tasted wrong. Evaporation ponds are the visible symbol of that bargain. Their footprint is vast, geometries optimized for sun and wind, but every hectare changes ground temperatures and capillary behavior under the crust. Liner technology has improved, yet seepage debates persist. A liner seam missed in a dust storm, a settlement wrinkle after a cold night, and brine finds a path. Operators monitor with piezometers and tracer salts. Communities monitor with buckets and salt rings. One gives you a spreadsheet, the other gives you a morning without birds. Legal frameworks tried to referee. Chile's water rights system separated consumptive and non-consumptive uses long before lithium boomed. Then Salars complicated it. Who owns brine? Who owns the freshwater perched above? Environmental approvals layered on thresholds for lens levels and lagoon salinity, tied to adaptive pumping quotas. Court orders began to bite. A judge in Antofagasta paused a wellfield expansion pending updated hydrological models. Another demanded public dashboards for lens depth at defined nodes. Transparency went from promise to permit condition. Case snapshots made the policy feel human. A protected lagoon's shoreline retreated beyond seasonal norms. Breeding pairs of Andean flamingos declined in a year that matched an uptick in nearby pumping. An NGO brought time-lapse images, a biologist brought salinity logs, and a local council brought receipts for tanker deliveries that had doubled. The company countered with a multi-year average showing variability within bands. The court asked a simple question: what happens when cumulative drawdown crosses a threshold nobody modeled? What nobody knew at the time was the threshold wasn't a cliff, it was a slow bend. A centimeter of subsidence across a wide crust reroutes shallow flow imperceptibly until a spring stops bubbling on a hot week and never quite returns. Add one more permit, one more well, one more dry summer, and the bend becomes the new normal. Hydrologists warned of nonlinearity, project plans rarely did. Meanwhile, regulators brought new tools. Satellites watched the Salars surface settle millimeter by millimeter. Machine learning flagged anomalies in lens levels relative to wind and temperature. A public portal plotted brine extraction rates against lagoon markers. The data didn't end arguments, it made them sharper. When a line wavered, a pumping plan had to ratchet down automatically. When a drought was declared, quotas tightened across operators, not just the unlucky one whose piezometer blinked first. Crosstown, negotiations moved from abstractions to meters. Indigenous councils insisted on co-located gauges, not just shared PDFs. FPIC agreements gained teeth, consent tied to hydrological triggers with enforcement spelled out. Benefit sharing shifted from lump sum payments to investments in resilient water. Leak-proof town networks, shaded storage, backup solar pumps, and independent monitoring teams trained and paid by escrow, not a quarterly goodwill line. Here's where hype met hydrology head-on. A DLE pilot promised lower water use and smaller footprints. The permit required a water accounting plan with real-time meters on every rinse loop, condensate recovery from dryers, and a chemistry match for re-injected brine. When the energy loads spiked during a cold front and rinse rates crept up, the dashboard caught it. The quota clipped the train for a week. The company grumbled. The council pointed at the clause everyone signed. In the aftermath of one bad season, thin snowpack, late storms, the basin ran on triage. Pumping quotas stepped down by rule. Tankers multiplied on the highway, not as PR, but as obligation. A Flamingo census found fewer nests. The Wildlife Service tightened a buffer zone. Markets noticed delivery slippage. Insurers nudged premiums. Contracts invoked hydrology clauses instead of lawyers' letters. While that was happening in New York, Rosa and Daniela walked back from the lagoon with a small victory. A new gauge sat on a post, its numbers visible without an app. Javier, on night shift, watched a trending screen with the same numbers mirrored in the corner. He eased a valve when the line dipped, not because a memo told him to, but because the basin's rules were finally written into his job. This was the moment everything changed, not the headline about a breakthrough, but the day thresholds got harder than promises. In the driest place on Earth, the only sustainable growth plan is the one the aquifer signs off on, quietly, in centimeters. The Lithium triangle chessboard, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia. While gauges blinked in the Atacama, politicians drew lines on maps. 3 flags, 1 plateau, and a web of roads and rivers that felt more like veins than borders. The Lithium triangle isn't a slogan here, it's a negotiation that never ends. Chile sits with the veterans' posture, decades of exporting, state ownership of lithium in principle, private operators in practice. A national lithium strategy promises more state say without chasing capital away. Contracts turn into trilogies, production quotas, water triggers, value-add requirements. A minister stands beside a chart and says, partnership, and everyone hears more oversight. Courts are sharper now. A hydrology clause can pause a wellfield, and a community veto can redirect a whole road. The upside is predictability if you pass the tests. The downside is a slower ramp when the world wants speed. Meanwhile, across Paso Llama, Argentina plays a different card. Provinces hold the power, governors court juniors, permits move if you shake the right hands. Rigs show up faster, camp kitchens fill quicker, and exploration maps bloom with logos. A CEO in Salta smiles at a ribbon cutting. We shaved 6 months. Then the fine print hits, brine chemistries that don't match Atacama's, grids that blink in afternoon heat, roads that turn to mud in summer rain. Investors like the welcome, engineers brace for logistics. A patchwork of royalties and community deals means the social license is negotiated valley by valley. It works until one valley says no. Bolivia watches from the roof of the world with the biggest mirror of all, uni shining like a cold sea. The state holds lithium like a flag. Pilot plants rise, foreign teams cycle through, and memorandums stack in folders stamped with emblems. A president promises local value. Batteries here, not just salts on ships. Engineers whisper about magnesium ratios that make chemistry hard, wet seasons that drown pond plans, and roads that turn days into weeks. The ambition is national, the pace geological. Sovereignty buys patience. Markets don't always share it. Meanwhile, China, the US, and the EU lean in with different offers. Chinese firms bring capital and offtakes bundled with converters and a flight of process engineers who know how to coax yield from ugly brines. Contracts tie shipments to refineries in coastal China and increasingly to new hydroxide plants in Europe that still run on Chinese know-how. American and European money arrives wrapped in terms, environmental baselines, FPIC letters, local processing, and security reviews with acronyms that slow signatures. A governor in Zhuzhou signs 2 MOUs in a week, one for speed, one for virtue, and hopes neither side reads the other's press release. Sanctions and screening laws creep into board meetings. A Canadian junior with a Chinese cornerstone investor finds its purchase of a neighboring Salar flagged in Washington and puzzled over in Brussels. A Chilean bid round adds a line about trusted partners, and lawyers measure trust in tariff codes. In Buenos Aires, a delegation flies back from Washington with a term sheet tied to a cathode plant in the Midwest if carbonate flows on time. In La Paz, a handshake with an Asian consortium promises a full value chain, then meets a season of rain. Infrastructure asymmetries pick winners quietly. Chile's ports and power lines shave days off schedules, its courts add days back. Argentina's new high-voltage corridor shortens a gap. A bridge washed out by summer storms lengthens another. A Bolivian road crew lays gravel across the Altiplano, a ribbon of certainty in a place where certainty is rare. A logistics manager keeps 2 calendars, one for permits, one for weather. Policy divergence shows up as price. Chile's tighter governance lowers some risks and raises others. Capital still comes, but it charges for time. Argentina's permissive stance lowers the front-end friction and raises operating surprises. Capital comes faster, then asks for hedges. Bolivia's sovereign path keeps outside money cautious. When it arrives, it's strategic, not speculative, and it waits for pictures of drums leaving a gate. According to traders, the real chessboard isn't the flags, it's the offtakes. A Korean cell maker locks 5 years of Argentine carbonate to balance a Chile-heavy book. A European automaker signs a conditional deal in Chile that triggers only if a DLE plant beats its water budget. A Chinese cathode giant prepays uni production as a long-dated option on Bolivian politics. The moves aren't about today's price, they're about not being the one caught short in a dry year. Everything was about to change when drought stopped being a forecast and became a schedule. Snowpack thin across the Andes, Chile's quotas tighten by rule, Argentina's by politics, Bolivia's by weather. The 3 systems respond on 3 tempos. Supply chains reroute, spreadsheets add a new tab named Precip. Even if the triangle expands, new Salars in Catamarca, a breakthrough in Uyuni, a stabilized ramp in Atacama, the same physics rule the desert. Flow rates, recharge, mixing fronts, and consent. The chessboard matters. The board itself is still halite. The alternatives that aren't, diversification myths. While ministers pointed to new pins on world maps, procurement teams tried to breathe easier, diversify away from one desert, smooth the ride. On paper, it looked clean. In practice, each escape route came with its own speed limit and its own hidden toll booth. Start in Western Australia, where hard rock got good at being fast. Spodumene doesn't wait on weather. You blast, crush, float, ship a concentrate, then refine to chemicals near ports or overseas. Timelines compress from seasons to months once a plant runs. But here's the thing: energy sits at the center of that speed. Concentrators gulp megawatts. Calciners and converters run hot. When power prices jump or grids tighten, cash flows lurch. And the chemistry swap doesn't erase bottlenecks, it moves them. Converters in China and an emerging set in North America or Europe must absorb a tide of concentrate, keep impurity profiles tight, and manage waste streams under stricter rules. Get a sulfuric acid shortage, a gas spike, or a permitting delay at a hydroxide plant, and you rediscover the same fragility, translated into kilns and stacks instead of ponds and lenses. Meanwhile, investors waved at Salars outside the Atacama, Catamarca, Salta, Zhuzhou, arguing that similar altiplano, similar sun, similar story. Similar, not identical. Brine chemistry shifts from one basin to the next. Magnesium nightmares creep in, boron lurks, calcium throws off balance. A flowsheet that sings in one Salar croaks in the next, and every tweak costs water, reagents, and time. Rain patterns differ too. Summer downpours can stall pond cycles just when you banked on throughput, washing dust and clays into pond trains, forcing cleanouts that steal weeks. A junior that learned this the hard way joked, "Our Gantt chart should have included the sky." Geothermal brines arrived with a promise almost too neat. Co-produce power and lithium, use the heat to drive chemistry, return the brine to the reservoir. At the Salton Sea, that's not hypothetical. Wells already circulate hot, metal-rich fluids, plants already push electrons to the grid. The rub sits in the brine itself, hot, scaling, corrosive, with iron and silica that love to deposit on any surface that slows them down. DLE modules must survive that bath for years, not months, and keep rinse loops closed enough that clean stays clean. Reinjection isn't a line item, it's the reservoir's lifeline. Change temperature or chemistry too much and permeability shifts, power drops, pressure regimes wander. The balance can be found, it isn't free. Recycling felt like the ace hiding up the sleeve. Why pull more from deserts if yesterday's battery can be tomorrow's feedstock? The logic is solid, the timing is. Even with EV sales booming, most packs on the road are young, under warranty, and not ready for the shredder. Feedstock today is a mix: manufacturing scrap, warranty returns, some consumer electronics, not the steady river planners want. Collection logistics are messy, batteries dispersed across dealers, junkyards, garages, chemistries mixed, states and countries arguing over hazardous classifications. Then comes chemistry, black mass varies. An LFP bus pack doesn't feed the same process as an NMC sedan pack. Hydromet lines must adapt, leachates must be tuned, sodium and fluorine handled safely. Quality downgrades lurk if trace impurities sneak into recovered metals, and one dirty lot can ripple through a cathode plant like a bad rumor. Here's where it gets interesting. Each alternative reduces risk on one axis while creating a new one on another. Hard rock diversifies geography but concentrates refining where permits are slow and power costs swing. Non-Atacama Salars spread basin risk but multiply chemistry headaches and summer weather surprises. Geothermal marries electrons and ions but binds you to subsurface behavior that refuses to be rushed. Recycling will matter hugely, but its curve lags the build-out by years. You can't recycle what hasn't aged. That doesn't mean the exits are fake. It means they're ramps with advisory speeds. A converter in Kwinana flips on, it still needs gas contracts and emissions permits that survive elections. A Salar in Salta hits its stride, it still pauses when El Niño sloshes rain over its pond walls. A DLE train at a geothermal plant posts great capture numbers in Q1. It still shows pressure-related maintenance by Q3 and a changed reinjection plan by Q5. A recycler touts 95% metal recovery. It still battles a patchwork of take-back laws and a shipment stuck at a border over a paperwork typo. Unknown to most people scanning headlines, some of the smartest contracts today are boring by design. A European automaker splits offtake, 1/3 Australian hydroxide, 1/3 Argentine carbonate with wet season flexibility, 1/3 a recycler ramping volumes under a floor price guarantee. A utility chooses LFP for a peaker replacement, cutting nickel and cobalt risk, then buys extra inventory to buffer shipping delays. A state greenlights strategic stockpiles of critical salts, not just finished cells, and writes inventory rotation rules so drums don't age into waste. But hold on, the biggest myth isn't that alternatives exist, it's that any one of them can let the rest of us relax. Diversification reduces the chance that one drought or one court order derails a quarter. It doesn't erase the physics of brines, the energy of rock, the chemistry of black mass, or the patience of reservoirs. In other words, the portfolio matters more than the poster child. Build it like a bridge, redundant members, known load paths, visible strain gauges, and you cross the gorge. Build it like a bet on a single beam, and you hold your breath every time a truck rolls by. So who pays when expectations outrun geology? Right now, it's everyone, villages waiting on tankers, engineers swapping clogged filters at midnight, CFOs explaining misses, and drivers wondering why their car's delivery date slipped again. The cost shrinks when we design for the limits, not around them. The next section asks how those costs land on people who live closest to the gates. Human stories at the edge, microeconomies and trade-offs. On payday, the plaza in San Pedro hums like a border town. A welder from Calama buys his daughter a bicycle with a Flamingo sticker. A shopkeeper quietly adds 3 pesos to the price of cooking oil. In a back room, a landlord counts envelopes and adds a new lock to a gate. Boom, wages arrive fast. Prices follow faster. In pain, a teacher keeps a second calendar, one for exams, one for water days. When the tanker schedule slips, she texts parents, pick up at noon. The mine-funded clinic opens late that afternoon because the tanker serves the school first. On the wall, a color chart marks asthma days alongside wind forecasts. You see how a town starts to run on 2 clocks. A microeconomy blooms along the brine line. A cousin with a pickup hauls drums for households that don't get regular deliveries. A mechanic opens a side business patching liners on rooftop tanks. A woman named Lourdes sells frozen empanadas to shift workers on the 6 a.m. bus. It's good money, she says, until the rotation changes and the bus is half full. Jobs tug against water and families balance in the middle. Jorge, a driller, sends home more cash than anyone in his clan ever did. His mother, who tended goats all her life, stares at the tap that sputters on windless afternoons. He pays for the big tank, she says, patting it like a new appliance. I still boil water for tea. When the well runs dry for a week, Jorge's bonus buys bottled water and bus tickets to Calama for laundry. A school story says the rest. 2 months after water days began, a company truck arrived with tablets and a promise of coding classes. The kids cheered. The principal smiled, then pointed at the cistern. We'll teach code, she said. First we need bathrooms to flush. A local crew installed low-flow fixtures. The first week they worked. The second, a valve stuck. A parent muttered, we asked for less thirst, not more screens. Benefits come with clauses that feel abstract until they aren't. In Tocono, a compensation framework offered cash, a clinic expansion, and a monitoring station with readings shared on an app. The contract added a line that tied tanker dispatches to operational conditions. When a pump outage coincided with a regional strike, trucks didn't roll for 2 days. The app still blinked green. They pay, says Daniela, but the fine print drinks first. Some agreements try to fix that. An Indigenous stewardship project rerouted funds into a community-owned water network, double-sealed pipes, shade on storage tanks, a solar pump with redundancy, and a Salars monitoring hut staffed by locals trained by a university team. For a year, leaks fell and tankers lost fewer hours to wind shutdowns. Then prices dipped, a mine paused an expansion, and the next year's tranche arrived late. A council meeting turned brittle. We're not a marketing line, a young farmer said. Meanwhile, co-management shows both its promise and its ceiling. In one valley, offtake payments fund a wildlife ward's Flamingo counts and seasonal grazing plans agreed by elders and engineers. It works because everyone can see the lagoon gauge and the pumping plan ratchets with it. In another, a similar model stumbles when a contractor rotates out and the replacement shrugs at the dashboard. The same rule appears across towns. Transparency buys trust, but only if someone picks up the phone at 2 a.m. Prices swing and so do lives. During the last spike, day rates for truck drivers jumped. A bakery raised bread prices twice in a month. When prices fell, overtime vanished first. A mason who financed a motorcycle on boom math handed over the keys and walked home. I'll get it back when the wind changes, he said, half grim, half hopeful. Still, resilience threads through. A women's cooperative in Sakaya switches from alfalfa to drought-tolerant quinoa, sells woven reed mats as art instead of livestock bedding, and negotiates a standing order with a hotel chain. The mine buys their mats for a visitor center. It's not charity, the co-op lead says. It's a receipt. In the same week, the school closes early for a tanker delay. But hold on, the benefits are fragile when the index jitters. A bonus, a clinic, a water line, each helps until a permit stalls or a quarter misses and a capital plan shrinks. The gap is felt on Rose's Street first. You hear it in the scrape of a bucket, the quiet when a bus doesn't stop, the cheer when a gauge holds steady through a hot week. The crisis only becomes global when factories feel the squeeze. Here, it's already daily life. A microeconomy built on brine learns to ride wind, prices, and patience, 3 things nobody controls. Industry's breaking point, EVs, grids, and the delay cascade. While co-ops adjusted planting calendars and gauges ruled valves, a different kind of thirst spread through factories. In a glass-walled conference room outside Seoul, a line manager stared at a whiteboard where a single word had been circled 3 times: spec. The new cell needed carbonate with magnesium below the threshold by 10 parts per million. 2 containers sat in port with numbers a hair above. He rubbed his temples. Rework or wait. Either choice broke a promise to an automaker that had already launched the ad. Unknown to him, in Michigan, a program manager clicked into a penalty clause. If qualified material didn't arrive by Friday, a ramp slipped, dealers lost their demo cars, and liquidated damages began to accrue at midnight. She had a second tab open with weather in Antofagasta and a third with a hydrology dashboard that wasn't supposed to matter in Detroit, but now did. The gauge had ticked low, the weak snowpack came in thin. On a loading dock in Poland, drums with perfect labels and the wrong profile were rerouted to a different line. A foreman watched forklifts shunt them aside. 2 weeks, he told his team. We blend and pray. He didn't say the quiet part. Scrap would rise, yields would fall, and someone would call him from Stuttgart asking why a warranty model had changed. Grid planners felt the drag too. A utility in Texas had promised 400 megawatt-hours of storage before summer. The vendors' packs were ready, but the cells inside those packs were waiting on the same couple of valleys. A project manager opened a meeting with a sentence that made the room heavy. We will miss August peak. The contingency plan involved diesel peakers and overtime crews. The board flinched at the cost and signed anyway. Contract clauses woke up. Take-or-pay agreements triggered discounts that preserved relationships while quietly draining margins. Force majeure letters appeared, not for hurricanes or strikes, but for adaptive pumping that ratcheted down in a dry year. Insurers took notes and revised premiums for delay coverage. A week later, a finance team rewrote a covenant with a phrase nobody expected to see in a term loan: hydrology exception. Meanwhile, substitution pressure crept in through side doors. An automaker's mid-range model switched to LFP to escape nickel volatility and to loosen the magnesium vice on carbonate specs. It bought breathing room, then ran into a different ceiling: pack size, cold weather performance, and a new set of supplier bottlenecks at phosphate converters. Sodium-ion DMOS arrived with fanfare and caveats, penciled in for city cars and stationary storage, where energy density mattered less. A purchasing lead wrote a note that sounded like a sigh: relief, but not release. This was the moment everything changed, not because a single factory shut down, but because hundreds of minor misses aligned. A missed tanker day in Payne became a rework in Poznan, became a penalty in Dearborn, became an overtime order at a gas plant near El Paso, became an earnings call where a CFO said headwinds and meant a pond he'd never see. Across industries, timelines began to echo hydrology. Cathode plants padded buffers, then discovered buffers tie cash. Automakers pulled forward orders from Australian hydroxide, only to meet a converter outage and a sulfuric acid shortage. Utilities requested alternate chemistries and asked for staggered deliveries that didn't line up with a ship's schedule. The cascade wasn't dramatic, it was relentless. From the engineer's perspective, it felt like living inside a domino trick where pieces fell slower than you thought and never stopped. A quality manager in Yokohama set up a war room for impurity drift and ran night shifts just to catch incoming drums before morning mix. A logistics coordinator in Rotterdam hired extra stevedores for seasonal swells. A planner in Shanghai added a row to the spreadsheet: drought adjustment. Insurers repriced risk. Lenders asked for water triggers in covenants. Rating agencies noted single basin exposure like they used to write single customer. Boardrooms learned to read lens levels. One automaker's CEO began every materials briefing with a single slide: lagoons, gauges, and valves. Don't talk to me about tons, she said. Talk to me about flow. What began as a rumor, water in a desert dictating car launches, settled into routine. The fix wasn't a miracle. It was a social contract that made schedules honest, diversified across chemistries, and paid for resilience instead of apologizing for its cost. Markets grudgingly priced patience. And the world learned what Rosa already knew at the lagoon: you plan by the trickle, or you plan to be late. The new social license: extraction with limits. Rosa's gauge and Javier's valve become policy when numbers leave clipboards and enter contracts. Water accounting goes first. Liters in, liters recycled, liters returned, posted live, audited quarterly tied to pumping. Adaptive quotas follow. If lens levels slip past a trigger, flows ratchet down automatically. No midnight calls, just rules. FPIC stops being a ceremony and becomes binding consent with veto power and escalation paths. Benefit sharing shifts from checks to baselined outcomes. Lagoon salinity bans, flamingo nests, leak loss percentages. Here's the thing, projects that accept limits borrow cheaper and build faster. Legitimacy isn't a cost, it's time saved when drought arrives. Climate pressure cooker, droughts, extremes, and systemic risk. While permits learned to speak in liters and gauges, the sky started writing faster. Warming shaved ice from the Cordillera like a dull knife. Less snowpack, earlier melt, stronger sun on bare rock. Evaporation didn't need help here, but it got it anyway. On hot weeks, the air felt hungrier. Ponds skinned over with salt faster, then stalled when night temps plunged, stretching cycles in a stutter step that planners couldn't smooth. The paradox hit hard. A rare burst of rain ran like applause across the crust and changed almost nothing below. Episodic storms slicked the surface, freshened the first centimeters, then left. Deep brines barely noticed. Recharge in this basin is a long negotiation, not a downpour. So the calendar began to tilt. Longer dry spells, sharper wind bursts, fewer predictable afternoons. Operators watched anemometers spike and rewired schedules around gusts instead of seasons. Dust found its way into every equation. With soils drier for longer, wind lifted fine grains off barren shoulders and drifted them onto pond trains like a slow-motion spill. Dust darkened brines, warmed surfaces, and shuffled the timing of precipitation, steps the way a wrong note shifts a melody. It also seeded crystallization where no one asked it to, forcing cleanouts and stealing days. Filters saw the same insult. Membranes that ran clean in May lost flux in September under the same duty. Someone would tap a gauge and say, same pressure, less flow, and the room would go quiet. Meanwhile, wind patterns nudged the game board. Afternoon gusts that used to taper now barreled on through dusk, shearing pond surfaces and driving evaporation at odd hours while splashing brine against berms built for calmer regimes. Engineers thickened liners and raised edges. A year later, a different pattern arrived, and the fixes felt like sandbags against a tide nobody could time. Power, the quiet partner, picked up the tremor. Out on the flats, solar arrays thrummed, all that sun turned to electrons, and still the grid blinked on heat-strained afternoons. Diesel gensets took the slack at a cost nobody liked. More fuel, more trucks, more exposure to transport hiccups. Storage penciled as the fix, but the irony cut deep. The same lithium that would steady the grid needed a schedule the grid couldn't yet guarantee. Projects paired PV with small on-site storage blocks to keep pumps and rinse loops steady through brownouts. It helped. It didn't erase the need for redundancy when a sandstorm shut inverters and forced crews to wait it out under a tin roof that rattled like a drum. Insurance underwriters started sounding like hydrologists. Premiums stepped up for facilities without hard thresholds and auto ratchets tied to lens levels. A policy addendum listed climate variability measures right beside fire suppression. When a company pitched a shiny DLE expansion without a power N1 plan, backup for the backup, the broker slid the quote higher by a notch. "Show me your drought table," she said, and the project laid opened a file labeled like a weather report, not a mine plan. In boardrooms, climate turned from backdrop to engagement driver. Investors asked for scenario runs, a 3-year thin snowpack, a sequence of wind anomalies, a pair of late summer deluges that clogged profilters and paused ponds just as term shipments stacked. The best slides didn't promise invincibility. They showed trip lines and responses. Slow here, shift flow there, truck rinse water from a secondary well only when the gauge sat above a line everyone could see. Meanwhile, financiers who once fought for allocation began stepping back from anything that looked like a bet on hope. Without hard thresholds, public, enforceable, and mapped, money priced in the unknown and drifted to easier stories. Rock near ports, recycling with contracted feed, smaller brine projects with oversized buffers. It wasn't a moral stance. It was yield adjusted for weather that stopped behaving like memory. In the basin, feedback loops made themselves known. Heat lifted more water, salinity crept in margins, Some plants shed leaves earlier and didn't return. Dust from new bare patches fed more dust. A pond train that needed 1 cleanout per quarter needed 2, then 3, until operators cut rates just to keep ahead of maintenance. Those cuts preserved the freshwater lens, but clipped deliveries that sat at the end of ocean schedules already sold. A trader in Singapore stared at a screen and watched a curve lift on a rumor about snowpack he couldn't verify. The pressure cooker felt systemic because it was. A hot month on the Altiplano became price risk in Shanghai, became project risk in Texas, became political risk in Brussels when a subsidy timeline collided with supply tightness and headlines said delay. The basin had always set the speed limit. Now climate nudged the sign lower. There's a way through, but it's narrower than the brochures allow. Hard thresholds that govern pumping, power built with redundancy and storage sized for dust and wind, flow sheets that reuse water like it's borrowed, and contracts that breathe with the lens. All of it costs more on day one and less when the wind changes. Without that, the transition leans on luck. While insurers recalculated and planners redrew Gantt charts around the sky, the world started looking for a pressure release valve that didn't require the desert to sprint. The next move wasn't about squeezing more from a fixed clock. It was about changing the mix of clocks we depend on. The exit ramps, chemistry shifts, and design pivots. If the basin won't speed up, change the parts of the machine that need its pace. That's where chemistry becomes a pressure valve. Automakers who once swore by nickel-rich cathodes for every segment began carving use cases. LFP took the middle: taxis, fleet sedans, crossovers that live in cities and charge often. It traded peak energy for calendar life, cost stability, and fewer impurity headaches. A procurement lead ran a back-of-the-envelope, one spec notch looser on magnesium tolerance, a simpler converter queue, and a gentler hit when a shipment drifts a week. The math didn't sing, it breathed. High manganese blends stepped into the lane between LFP and nickel-heavy. Engineers sold them as a bridge: better energy than LFP, less nickel and cobalt than NMC 811. A pilot line in Korea tweaked coatings and electrolyte blends to tame manganese dissolution, and a European automaker slotted the chemistry into long-range trims that didn't need track day performance. The upside was geopolitical as much as chemical. A broader menu meant fewer single-point failures when one feedstock tightened. Sodium-ion arrived like a new instrument joining the band. Limited range, yes, but tuned for the right songs. Stationary storage that sits in yards and substations. Delivery vans that loop across town. 2 Chinese cell makers shipped first waves with density no one would brag about and cycle life that quietly impressed. A utility planner eyed the spec sheet and saw relief. No lithium, cheaper metals, a pack that smiles at cold better than LFP. He still circled a caveat: supply chains built from scratch don't scale on press releases. An order went in anyway, sized modestly and placed right next to a tried LFP block. Not either or, both and. Meanwhile, design started paying down demand the old-fashioned way by needing less. Vehicle teams shaved mass without chest beating, thinner glazings that still passed noise tests, castings that replaced weld forests, tire compounds with lower rolling resistance that didn't feel greasy in rain. A mid-size SUV lost 70 kilograms across a model refresh. The pack shrank a module and kept range. Engineers grinned because the win didn't require a chemistry miracle, just discipline. Charging curves learned the same lesson. Smart thermal management and cell format tweaks turned a sawtooth into a slope that felt fast for longer. 10 to 80% dropped by minutes, not seconds, and suddenly, the acceptable pack size in a fleet bid slid down 1 notch. A transit agency reran routes with midday top-ups at depots, avoided the biggest batteries, and freed a slice of upstream pressure that would have landed on the Salar. Design for recycling moved from a conference slide to a drawing release. Cell-to-pack architectures got barcodes baked into tabs, chemistries declared in plain sight, and fasteners specs for tools a recycler actually owns. A supply agreement added a new clause. The OEM takes back end-of-life packs into a locked loop. The recycler gets volume certainty, and the recovered metals flow back to a named cathode line. The loop didn't close the mass balance today. It put a date on when it might. Traceability tightened the weave. QR codes followed drums of carbonate and hydroxide through converters, cathode mixers, cell lines, and packed plants. A misspec container tripped alarms earlier, became a warehouse shuffle instead of a late-night scrap pile. Regulators in Brussels and Sacramento made it law. Factories discovered it saved money even without the threat of fines. Reverse logistics pilot programs learned to move hulking packs with fewer fire marshals and more predictability. Grid planners flexed in parallel, peak shaving with smarter tariffs, demand response that paid factories to pause, and behind-the-meter storage at logistics hubs nudged the need curve flatter. Each nudge translated to fewer megawatt-hours of new packs that had to arrive on a schedule the desert couldn't guarantee. In one city, a building code tweak required conduit for future storage in every new multi-tenant warehouse. It looked small. In 3 years, it made add-on packs a weekend job instead of a month-long permit dance. Strategic reserves turned from crude oil nostalgia to dry chemical policy. A finance minister signed off on buffer inventories of battery-grade salts and critical reagents, soda ash, lime, PVDF binders, stored within a day's truck roll of cell plants. Rotation rules kept drums fresh, and release thresholds referenced hydrology dashboards as much as prices. When a dry season clipped shipments, the reserve bled slowly, buying weeks of calm that didn't appear on earnings calls as a surprise. Here's the thing, most of these pivots only work together, and some only work if Atacama stabilizes. LFP can absorb a chunk of demand, but it still wants high-purity carbonate and a converter schedule that doesn't hiccup. Sodium ion can take slices of the market, but the anode hard carbon feedstock and new separator lines need time. High manganese blends reduce nickel dependence, then remind you manganese sulfate plants are their own bottleneck. Recycling becomes a river, but only after a decade of EVs becomes a lake of old packs. But wait, there's more. Several of these changes backfire if we treat them like excuses to ignore the lens. Bigger buffers without water triggers are just cash in barrels that hide risk until it spills. Faster chargers without thermal discipline burn through cell life and move replacement curves forward, not backward. QR codes on drums won't help if the brine behind them was pumped on a day the gauge said don't. The exits are real, they're ramps with posted speeds. You take LFP for the middle, high manganese for the bridge, sodium ion where density doesn't rule, and you design vehicles, chargers, and logistics to sip instead of gulp. You trace, you standardize, you build reserves, and you write every contract to breathe with the aquifer. Individually, each cut shaves a corner. Together, they widen the road just enough for the transition to fit. Which brings us back to the secret under the salt. Chemistry can change lanes, design can lighten loads, but the clock in the desert still decides how fast the caravan moves. The hidden reason why the desert decides the timeline. We've tried to bend every lever, chemistry, finance, logistics, but the same quiet law keeps showing up on the printouts. The basin's hydrogeology and its iron balances set the speed limit, not policy, not budgets. The way water moves through fractured volcanics, ignimbrites, and ancient salt, the way lithium sits as a trace passenger in brine, and the way pressure holds a freshwater lens above that brine, those are the governors. To understand why, go down a level. The Salar isn't a lake you can drain and refill. It's a layered cake of halite, clays, and porous units cut by faults that act like valves. Lithium lives dissolved in brine that migrates painfully slowly through this framework, carried by pressure gradients that change with seasons, storms, and the pull of wells. Pump too hard and the gradient steepens, but the brine can't sprint, it creeps. So wells start sucking older, saltier, or just weirder fluids. The lithium grade wobbles, impurities ride along, and your plant's perfect flowsheet begins to cough. Meanwhile, the freshwater lens that keeps lagoons alive isn't separate in spirit. That lens perches on the brine like a drifting bubble. Lower the brine too far, and the bubble tilts. That tilt shows up first as a spring that arrives late, a lagoon shoreline that doesn't come back, a flamingo nest with no shallow water to feed from. Here's the catch: you can accelerate paperwork. You can't accelerate residence time. The water that falls on high shoulders of the Andes and percolates through permeable seams, the melt that seeps under gravel fans, the rare storm that soaks a slope and sends a thin pulse underground, all of that takes years to register in the Salar. Permits can move in months, recharge answers in decades. When a plan assumes next year's inflow will pay for this year's draw, it isn't aggressive, it's blind. Technology shortens parts of the loop, but not the loop itself. DLE can pull lithium faster from a given liter, which is real. It can tighten quality, cut acreage, and designed correctly, reuse rinse water until it squeaks. Still, every liter you process left a pore somewhere. If you don't return compatible brine at compatible temperature, pressure fields bend. If you do return it right, you're still bound by how quickly that brine can find its way back through a crust that closes like a fist when you dry it. Energy, reagents, and waste add their own ceilings. Heat loss at night in thin air steals kilowatt-hours. Acid cycles that look elegant on a bench get dinged by iron and organics in the field. Net gains exist. They aren't magic. Finance can shuffle risk, not water. A hedge reduces exposure to price, not to a late snowpack. A sovereign guarantee soothes a lender, not a lagoon. Offtake clauses with hydrology triggers help, but the trigger's source is the same static truth, the lens level and the brine's pace. Structuring can buy time across a quarter. It can't conjure flow where geology says no. Here's the crazy part. The basin's chemistry itself enforces patience. Pull lithium too hard and you skew the brine's iron ratios. Magnesium, calcium, boron shuffle. The plant compensates with more reagents. The cost climbs, the waste grows. And if reinjection returns the wrong soup, you erode the very gradients that carry lithium to your wells. Try to correct with fresh water and you convert a brine problem into a social one. Every liter of clean water you spend polishing a process is a liter a village measures at its tap. Policy can clean the lane. It can standardize water accounts, require compatible reinjection, mandate adaptive pumping tied to gauges, and force transparency that kills wishful thinking. It can designate buffer zones that keep mixing fronts away from lagoons. It can even stagger permits so the basin never shoulders simultaneous expansions. What it cannot do is abolish subsidence once you've crossed a bend, or reverse a dried capillary that used to feed a spring. In a hyperarid system, eras last longer than terms of office. The desert decides the timeline because the desert stores time in salt. Pores open and close on seasonal breaths. Pressures rise and fall by centimeters. Irons shuffle at rates that scoff at investor decks. Ignore that, and you get a boom that burns itself brittle, ponds that need constant cleanouts, DLE trains that underperform, communities that turn every valve into a protest. Listen to it, and you end up with something slower and tougher. Quotas that ratchet with gauges, plants designed like misers, contracts that breathe, portfolios that don't lean on one valley for a whole quarter's promises. In the end, our fastest route runs straight through respect for the basin's physics. The caravan moves at the speed of pores, not headlines. The only choice is whether we plan around that or let it plan for us. Resolution: a deal with the desert. So the deal looks like this. Set an achievable ceiling the aquifer can live with, pumping quotas linked to lens levels and subsidence trends, auto ratchets that cut flow when gauges blink, and reinjection chemistry matched to native brine so pressure fields hold. Pair that with diversification built for redundancy, LFP where it fits, high manganese where it bridges, sodium ion where density doesn't rule, recycling designed into products from the screw-up. Build transparent water accounting, live dashboards at the fence and online, audited, enforced, and simple enough for Rosa to read and Javier to run. Benefits follow rules, not moods. Investment into leak-proof town networks, shaded storage, backup solar pumps, and wildlife baselines tied to payments. Permits reward discipline, lower royalties for operators that beat water intensity thresholds, faster approvals for projects with hard triggers, cheaper capital for contracts that carry hydrology covenants. The payoff isn't flashy. It's credible timelines, slower than hype, faster than fear, backed by meters, not metaphors. Do that and power shifts to those who respect the speed limit. The desert won't sprint, it will partner. And that partnership is the only path that keeps lagoons alive, valves honest, and the transition on a schedule the planet can trust. What matters now? The rush to end oil runs through deserts that can say no, and they're starting to. The winners won't be the fastest, but the ones who make promises to gauges, not headlines. If you want the next chapter, the countries racing to build a lithium firewall, the contracts with hydrology teeth, and the chemistries that actually buy time, watch the follow-up and subscribe. Tap the bell so you don't miss the maps, the meters, and the deals that decide who delivers and who delays.